Welcome to Good Thinking Live, everyone. Welcome, good thinkers from all across the globe. And I am so glad to have you here. Let us know who you are and where you're from. People streaming in live from LinkedIn and from YouTube Live. I didn't give much notice for this one because I was kind of busy this week. So hopefully we'll have lots of participation, but without a lot of advance notice, sometimes not. So we'll see. But I am so glad that everyone is here who does show up every Monday morning. I mean, most Monday mornings at 9 a.m. Pacific time in the US, 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, to take a little bit of time to think about our thinking. Set aside all the what to think so we can work on improving how we think. So let us know who you are and where you're from. We've got the first good thinker in the house, Barkley from Washington, D.C. Woohoo! Welcome. Be sure that you share your comments in the chat, and I'll try to bring in as many of your comments as possible. And like I said, we might have a skinny audience today because I was so delinquent in getting started, even though I'm really, really, really excited about today's topic. We've got another good thinker from Washington, D.C. Rachel's in the house. Woohoo! So we've got some good thinkers from our nation's capital, and we've got Ahmed from Egypt. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Abdurrashid from, let us know who you are, let us know where you're from. Asma from KSA, Saudi Arabia. We've got the KSA in the house. We've got Egypt in the house. We've got DC in the house. Fantastic. All right. We've got a couple more. I want to just say, we've got Muteb from Saudi Arabia, and we've got Muhammadu from Brooklyn, New York, and we've got Hussein from Afghanistan, and Cassio from Paris. Bonjour. Welcome, welcome, welcome. All right. Keep them coming. Carrie from, LinkedIn. You see how it says LinkedIn. Sometimes I don't know who you are, but I will say from Cary, North Carolina, from Nigeria, from Oman, from greetings from the home of the Western Meadowlark. From England, Paul from England, Ricardo from Atlanta. Fantastic. Okay, so we're getting some good thinkers in the house to get started talking about thinking about complicated versus complex. Now, how many of you think when you think about the difference, so you think about a problem that you're going to solve, an issue, maybe an issue at work or at home, and you think, gosh, this is really complicated. It's complex. How many of you think about complicated and complex interchangeably, like they're the same word? And how many of you think that there is a difference between complicated and complex that you regularly consider when thinking about decisions or problems that you have to solve? How many of you think about it regularly as similar and how are the same, and how many of you think about them as different? Put it in the chat. Put it in the chat. Put it in the chat. Hi from India, Gopal Krishna, and Alberto from Texas. Okay, how many of you think about them differently, complex versus complicated, differently versus the same? So share it in the chat. I hope by the end of today, not only will you think about these two concepts differently, but you'll think about them in a way that will massively improve your decision making. Okay, so we've got someone says different. Excellent. We've got a root from India. Okay, so we say someone says, I use them interchangeably. Most people do. So that's not anything that most people do. This is just a little mental hack that can help you make better decisions. And we have got, yay, we think Ahmed says differently. Rachel says interchangeably, but excited to learn about the differences. Excellent, differently. All right, so let's get started. Do you think of complexity as just kind of a higher order of complicated? For people who think of them, some people are already saying different, but even for the people who are saying different, do you think of complexity as just kind of a harder complicated? Anyone want to share how you think about them as different? All right, here's the question that you can actually answer in the chat. What type of problem is harder to solve? This is a little bit of a trick question. A complex problem, so put complex if you think it's complex, or B, a complicated problem. What type of problem is harder to solve? Okay, so Cassio says, we've got a lot of scrolls. I might not be able to. Okay, Cassio says, although I know the difference when I'm talking about problems, I always say complicated. Excellent, fine, perfect. Complex, more time to approach. Interesting. Okay, don't disagree with that. Complicated is something that requires more skills and more time. Maybe. Complex, multi-layers to unearth. Complicated at the outset, but can be solved. Okay, we've got ding, 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 rubber chickens, rubber chickens. And Jose says, let's see, we've got multidisciplinary. Complex is harder to solve. Someone else says complicated is harder to solve. Complex is harder to solve. Both are hard. Complicated is harder to solve, but complex might take longer. Ooh, we're getting some great answers here, and I love all the participation. All right, this is great. All right, so if a problem, let's break out the differences, and then we're going to get into, because it's not so easy, but what you want to know is when you're thinking about a problem, you want to be aware of thinking about it one way when it really should be thought of in another way. And then you can break it out. So this is going to be, I think that for me, this has been a game changer. All right. If a problem is complex, it means that it has many components. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But when you think about a problem being hard to solve, it's usually something that's complicated, because the complicated problems are solvable. And complicated refers to a high level of difficulty. If a problem is complicated, there may or may not be many parts, and it will be hard, but it's solvable. And here's the difference between complicated and complex. Keep your comments coming. Oopsie, that's not what I wanted to do. I want to make more room for your comments by removing this banner so we have more room for the comments. Okay, so we've got some good complex. I'm going to pull, involves ambiguity. Brilliant. Complex needs new ideas. Absolutely. And here's the difference. Think of a complicated issue as one where components can be separated and dealt with in a systematic or logical way. So there's a way that a problem can be solved. Complicated challenges rely on a set of rules or algorithms. And bear in mind, those rules can change. You can update the rules. But, it's kind of like you put enough effort in, you can come to a solution. And we'll talk about some of the different things, and you'll weigh in to see whether you think they're complicated or complex. So even if you might think of it as a recipe. Like, it might be hard to figure out. You might have a very complicated recipe with all these different things where you can make a lot of mistakes along the way. But if you follow the recipe, you can predict an outcome. Okay, so if you follow a recipe, once you do, you can keep doing it. Like, you could, if you get a complicated recipe and you figure it out, you could keep using that recipe and you have a predictable outcome. And sometimes, you might have different ingredients, whatever, but when you think about a complicated problem, you can figure out a way to solve it. When you see problems that come from causes that can be individually distinguished, like, I see why that happens, then they can be addressed piece by piece. For each input, you could have a proportionate output so that you can have some kind of control. Complicated problems are addressed by solutions. What about complex? What about complex problems? Complex, new ideas. Let's see what we're saying. The brain gets stumbled. It blends both. Absolutely. Practice. It's so easy to just think of it as one versus the other. But if you practice distinguishing it and saying, and breaking down complex problems into complicated problems, it's a game changer. Okay, so complexity is complicated and complication is complex. Okay, all right. I will try to get a little bit of a change in the way you're thinking. I mean, these aren't right or wrong answers, remember, because these aren't what to think, these are how to think. And so these are just ways, little mental tools, mental models to improve how we think. Complex problems and systems result from a network of multiple interacting causes that can't be individually distinguished. So you can't say, that's what causes homelessness. That's what causes the economy to tank. That's why that war was won or lost, or that, because we do it all the time. We simplify complex things into complicated things, but what do we miss when we do that? Small inputs in complicated things may result in disproportionate effects. Like, you might have at your company you put this whole change in place where you're going to institute a new policy, you're going to update your mission and your value statements, and you do all this stuff and you put this whole structure in place, and it doesn't have, maybe it has an effect that you think, but all of a sudden out of nowhere, some tweet or someone shares an email and the whole thing unravels because you're dealing with people and you're dealing with complex systems. And I'll get into it so it makes a little bit more sense when we get into the examples. But think of a complex issue as one that you can't get a firm handle on the parts. There are no rules, no algorithms, no recipe or natural laws. There's not one solution. So things that are complex have no degree of order or control or predictability. Now you can think probabilistically, which we'll get into with complex issues, but a complex thing is challenging and different because the sum of the parts don't all come together in a predictable way. Complex systems adapt organically, but not systematically. And so the goal with complex systems is to make, or the complex problems, is to make sense of the system. So maybe you're lucky and you figure out a complex problem once. You figure it out once. But whatever you did this time doesn't generate the same result. So here's a question. Should you address complicated issues and complex issues in the same way? Aha. Abduraja says by dissecting. We're going to get into that. I think that's a little hint. And Mauricio says emergent properties. Complex issues have emergent properties that you cannot predict. Brilliant. Yes. Complexity is a mix of multicultural subjects. Sometimes yes. Sometimes yes. Excellent. Excellent. So should you address complicated and complex issues the same way? And Abduraja says no. And I'm going to agree. It's important not to address them the same way, but we're going to get into how to think about it. Okay, so we're going to go through a bunch of things, and you tell me whether you think that's complex or complicated. Again, it's kind of in general. There's not like a, So how about building an electric car? Is building an electric car complex or complicated? What do you think? Building an electric car, complex or complicated? And while I'm waiting for your answers, I'll bring in, because there's a little lag between the live stream. Two people dating can address and solve their complications. When more people come to the party at the wedding, it becomes complex. Yes, probably true. Probably true. People, I think anytime you're dealing with people, you're dealing with complex systems. So what about building a car? Okay, so Jose says complex. Pragna says complicated. We've got complex, complicated, complicated, complex. Barclay says complicated. I'm going to say, let's see, complex. I'm just going to click on some of these. Complex yet exciting. Haha. All right. I'm going to make an argument for thinking about building a car as complicated. You can't, it's going to be really complicated. You're going to have all kinds of things. But once you figure it out, you might have updated legislation, so you have to change the rules here, or you have new infrastructure, so you have to make tweaks there. But there's some predictability. Once you figure out the recipe, you can think of building a car as complicated. Maintaining it is complicated. I mean, and again, don't think of it as hard versus easy. Complex and complicated shouldn't be thought of as neither complex nor complicated or simple. But when you're thinking about hard, you're thinking about solving. When you're thinking about complex, you're thinking about managing. That'll give you a little hint as to how to answer this. So think about complex as managing. You kind of have to dance with complexity. You have to be adaptable. You have to be open. You have to move with complexity. You have to constantly be testing and whatever. With complicated, think of solving. You can have rules. All right, so let's get into it. How about providing housing for 1,000 people? Providing housing for 1,000 people. Complicated or complex? What do you think? Housing, providing housing. Okay, and your comments are going to come in, so there's going to be a lag, but I'm going to say that think about that as complicated. It's very complicated. All these different people have different needs, whatever, but you can solve the problem. You can solve the problem providing housing for 1,000 people. What about Addressing homelessness. Addressing homelessness. So providing housing for 1,000 people, not to say that it's going to be the greatest housing, not to say that they're going to stay there forever, not going to say that it's going to solve any problem with homelessness. So providing housing for 1,000 people is complicated. It's complicated. Solving homelessness, complex. And by the way, thinking that providing housing for 1,000 people is solving homelessness is conflating complex and complicated in a way that can be misleading and lead to unintended consequences and wasted resources. So think about the difference between that. How about this? Building a quantum computer. Complicated or complex? Highly, highly, highly complicated. But once people learn and then they learn to build a better one, building something that where you know, is usually you can solve the problem and it's complicated. Merging two companies. Now that gets too mushy because what does it mean to merge two companies? Successfully merging two companies. When you're merging two companies, there are laws and regulations that have to be in place. So there's a lot of complicated issues, but the overall issue is complex. Managing people. You could merge two companies together. It's complicated. You could do it, but managing people, complex. It's a little, the distinction is, okay, so complicated, exactly. Complex, solving homelessness. I still prefer the homelessness. Okay, complex, only one will emerge when you merge. Okay, but think about it differently. Think about it less like maybe what you would read in a Harvard Business Review article and more like how you internalize and approach it. That's kind of a good way to think about it. All right. So what about figuring out how the market will react to a new product or strategy? Complicated or complex? Figuring out how the market will react to a new product or strategy. Anytime you're dealing with markets and you're dealing with people, it's complex. Now you can do your focus groups, you can understand your customer profile, but that can change. With one bad tweet, your customers can take a turn over here or whatever. Programming artificial intelligence. Programming, complicated. But there are solutions. You can do it. It's complicated. Pandemic responses, complex. Tax law. What about tax law? This is a good one. Very hard distinction. Are you solving or are you managing? Tax law. Well, tax law, you think, well, that changes all the time. Right. But anytime that you can apply rules, even if you're updating the rules regularly, you can think about it as complicated. You can think that you have an input, you can expect an output. Might be you have an input, you can expect these three outputs, but there's some predictability. The economy. How many times do you see economists trying to explain the economy as complicated? And it's really complex. What do you do in your life or deal with in your life where someone approaches, or maybe you approach it, something as complicated, where it has a solution, when really it would be better understood as complex? Oh, all we have to do in this country to solve for this gun violence is gun control. Perfect example of addressing a complex issue with complicated thinking. All right. So we've got some good comments I want to bring in. Complicated at first, later the new product will make it complex. Exactly. But think about putting guardrails around the problem. Once you open it up, closed systems are complicated. Open systems, complex. Actually, let me ask a question. What's more common? Complicated or complex? Complicated or complex? What's more common? I'm going to bring your comments in. All right. Tax law is complicated because the next set of laws are bound. So think about, yes, exactly. Tax laws are complicated and you can have new ones coming in all the time, but they do provide rules. There's some guardrails around them. What's more common? Complicated or complex? Anyone want to take a stab? We'll get to it at the end. So just share more complicated. What's more common, not complicated, I meant to say. What's more common, complicated or complex? All right, there's two ways of thinking that involve kind of a different mindset. One is expectations. So when should you expect a solution? When should you expect a solution? Complicated or complex? Complicated. With a solution, you should expect a solution when things are complicated. Skills. When should you use root cause analysis? Complicated or complex? Root cause analysis. Anyone want to take a stab? So we've got Gopal Krishna says more common, complicated. Larita says complicated. Complex is more common. Aha! Ding, 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 ding. Complex is way more complicated. Barclay says, I think complicated problems are more common because each solution to a complex problem involves multiple complicated challenges. I think that is, I still think complex is more common. Complex, I agree. Complicated. Sufala says complicated. Root cause is for complicated. Ding, 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 ding. Excellent answer. Root cause analysis is for complicated. When should you use probabilistic thinking? Basically looking and saying, okay, the likelihood is, I'm going to put a number on the likelihood. Not that it's very likely or not likely, but I'm going to put a number on the likelihood. When should you use probabilistic thinking? You can use probabilistic thinking for things that are complicated. You can put likelihoods, but there's so much uncertainty that you're acknowledging uncertainty because these are systems that have a lot of interacting components, self-emergent components. Okay, how about tolerances for ambiguity, which requires, when you're dealing with complex versus complicated, which requires you to tolerate more ambiguity? We've already got some good answers here. Root causes for complicated. Larita, yeah, the root cause is complicated. Which requires more tolerance for ambiguity? Complicated or complex? In some ways, complex problems can be easier. I know that seems weird. I mean, you don't think about complex. You really, actually, it's not helpful, super helpful to think of complex as easy or hard because you're dealing with managing, not solving. So that's a little bit of it. Move your easy to hard over to complicated. It helps. Root cause is both. Root cause is both. I would argue that root cause analysis is complicated because there's not a one by definition in a complex challenge or problem or system. There's not one, it's not one input, one output, or one input, predictable output. So root cause is probably better to understood as complicated. Complex requires more tolerance. Ding, 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 ding. Yes. Rubber chickens. Complex systems, complex challenges, complex problems requires more tolerance for ambiguity because there is more ambiguity. So, you're not going to get a clear solution. You got to manage it. You got to dance with it. You got to be open. You got to deal with and tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty. Complicated and complex challenges require dramatically different leadership styles. Okay. So here's another one. What works better in hierarchical organizations or structures? Let me even phrase it. How do hierarchical structures benefit complicated versus complex? Anyone want to take a stab at that? Where would you maybe institute or implement a hierarchical structure to address complicated issues or complex issues? Let us know. Okay, so we've got complex requires more tolerance for ambiguity. Absolutely. Complex issues requires more complex. Yes. And we've got complicated. So I'm not sure which one you're answering. So but because there's a delay, so I apologize. All right. So which works better with hierarchical structures? Maybe that was what you're answering. Arup says complicated. That's right. Complicated problems can work with more hierarchical structured rules than loosey-goosey guidelines, for sure. So what about guidelines? Guidelines are really good for thinking about complexity, complex problems. So that's where you kind of think about rules versus guidelines. Because if you have a rule for something that's complex and the thing doesn't react the way the rule says it's going to react, then what good is the rule? But guidelines can help you with how to think. As a matter of fact, is good thinking complex or complicated? Is good thinking complex or complicated? Let me know what you think. All right. So for complicated problems, again, think solving, figure it out, create a recipe, use rules, tweak, update for sure, and repeat. Complicated problems can be hard to solve, but you can address them with algorithms even. They can also be resolved with systems and processes like a hierarchical structure to command, to kind of give guidelines, whatever. For complexity, think managing. Again, you have to dance with complexity. Can't remember who said that first. I want to give attribution, but I can't remember. But dancing with complexity, I kind of like that. Like managing is kind of like dancing with it versus solving. With complexity, guidelines work better. Guidelines guide, rules define and dictate. And with complexity, you could use scenario planning where you imagine possible futures, or you imagine the different systems thinking where one can lead to this and this and this. All right. So we've got both. We've got complicated. At the end, you get a solution by good thinking. So what is good thinking? I think, and maybe you're right, Loretta. I'm not sure. I guess I haven't given it a thought. I don't know if there's a right answer. I think of good thinking as more complex, but there's probably elements of complicated. And this is an important thing that we're going to get to before we end. Good thinking depends on the condition. Okay. And excellent. So just think, am I solving this or am I managing this? And, when you say all we need to do okay, let me give you a perfect example. A technological disruption like blockchain is a complex problem because a competitor with an innovative business model is a complex problem. If you launch a product, once you launch that product, because your competitors aren't there, your competitors aren't standing still. Your customers aren't standing still. You're dealing with people, and people are complex. So it's very important to think about those things. Like there are a lot of moving parts, and you're not going to move one way and have only three options in a lot of these cases. Think about healthcare. How many of you, and you don't have to say it in the chat, but we all have friends and relatives and maybe ourselves that we're dealing with medical issues that are not that easily defined. Well, in the US, our healthcare system looks at healthcare as a complicated issue. They look at you as an individual patient or collectively as a group of patients as complicated. You have diabetes, you need to manage your insulin, you're fine, it's complicated. But what happens when you have all of these symptoms and you go to the doctor and the doctor tries this and the doctor tries that and the doctor tries this and the doctor tries that, and they're looking at it as a complicated system. They just need to find the solution, the right pharmaceutical, the right medical device, the right surgery, and nothing works. So what do they say? Well, sorry, it doesn't exist. Whatever you have doesn't exist. But this is the problem of addressing a complex system as if it's complicated. And this is a problem with our healthcare system a little bit, because when we get to personalized medicine, where we can maybe have a chip in our bodies and it can tell all the different goings on in our body, our bodies interact with everything in the environment, pollution and the trees and our level of sun and our genetics and the bacteria and viruses we come in contact with. Yet our medical system looks at medicine as a complicated system. And this way of looking at things in a different way is kind of, there is a right or wrong. Our bodies are complex systems, and yet medicine is looking at it as a complicated system. And you can see where that gets really frustrating when you can't get a diagnosis, or you get a diagnosis, but you look at the other people with that diagnosis and you're like, how much do they need to be like me for us to share this diagnosis? This is where you get into this complicated versus complexity. All right. The key is not to default to complicated thinking, putting rules in place and jumping to quick but faulty conclusions and failing to see unintended consequences or second, third, and fourth order effects. Beware of believing you're dealing with complicated systems and therefore assuming you're able to control outcomes instead of putting things in place to manage things as they change and evolve. So what's the danger of thinking a challenge is complex when it's really complicated? What's the danger? I mean, we now know that there's a danger in thinking that something's complicated when it's complex. What about thinking something's complex when it's just complicated? I don't mean just, but when it's complicated. What happens when we look at that? Well, we throw up our hands and say, we can't solve that problem. So it's important to think about these differences, but also understand that in any complex challenge, homelessness, whatever, gun control, medical, healthcare, the economy, there are complicated problems within that complex system that can be addressed. But then just beware that once you fix a complicated problem within a system of complexity, you got to manage that. All right. So that is really it. I mean, really, it just comes down to thinking about, and the reason we did this, and we're at 30 minutes now, so I want to kind of say goodbye. But the reason that we did this is I mentioned this in Another Good Thinking, and I had like 3 different people send, hey, I want to know more about that complex, complicated. So I was like, wait, what was that one thing last night? I was thinking, what was that topic we were supposed to go deeper on? So that's why I brought this up. This was going to be scheduled for a few weeks out. So adding more people to systems tends to not help with complex things unless you're adding people who can really bring a different perspective to understand how to manage complexity. But bringing more people in can help solve a problem for sure. So it's not such a bad idea when you're dealing with complicated challenges. And just beware of stress making complicated things look complex, because the complexity bias can make us ignore possible solutions because we are so stressed out that we think a complicated thing that's really hard is just complex. But also beware of confidence making complex things look complicated. And think about the opposites of complex and complicated. With complicated, work toward the right answer. With complex, dance with it, manage it, and always be looking for unintended consequences. Thanks for joining. See you next week. Keep a lookout for next Monday's show. And I'm sorry, I'm going to bring a few more comments in as we sign out.